Very much for that. Wait a sec. Well, welcome everyone. This is our first event of 2024 on this Experts at Work webinar, which is for members of all three of our networks. And a big welcome to Emma Cantor. Emma's a former HR director who's an executive coach and runs her company Mind Values Leadership, and has done a lot of research and thinking on today's topic, which could not be more relevant for members, and is how to manage emotions and protect yourself, remaining resilient when expected to carry others' emotional baggage. So it struck me this is a little bit like who helps the helpers, in a sense. Emma's going to take us through some of the key ideas and mechanisms, and we're just recording this part of the session, Emma's input. The rest is under the Chatham House rule to allow you, the network members, to speak more freely. So we're going to, after Emma's session, we'll have a breakout session in small groups of around 3, so you can swap notes and what's going on in terms of this challenge for you. And then after that, we'll get back in the round to swap notes more generally as a group, and then they'll have a hard finish at 12 o'clock. So if you haven't already, please do put yourself on mute for now. Thank you ever so much. And Emma, please feel free to share the slides, and all yours. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Richard. So welcome, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. But I thought I'd start with a little bit of a story in terms of the context around why I might be presenting this and why it's of interest to me. So 8 years ago, I left what became my last in-house HR role. I didn't know that was what was going to be happening at the time. I had every expectation to go and find a new in-house HR role. And I guess I didn't realise at the time what was really the motivation behind me leaving. We had been restructuring probably for about 3 years, and I'd been constantly working on redundancy programs. And when I left, as all good HR people do, I managed to negotiate my own redundancy, which gave me an opportunity to take a little bit of time out. And it was that kind of pivot point around taking some time out where I realised that I was actually emotionally and mentally burnt out. And then I guess I spent some time reflecting on why, and realised that I actually needed to kind of do a little bit of healing and a little bit of rest and rejuvenation, and then have subsequently probably spent the last 7 to 8 years working out why I'd got to that place and how I'd got to that place. And I think the kind of key takeaway is I'd become an emotional sponge. I was absorbing a lot of other people's emotional negative energy, both from individuals, the teams and the organisation. And I'm sure you can appreciate when an organisation has been going through 3 years of restructuring and redundancy that there's a lot of baggage, per se, held in the organisation. And I was picking it up, and it was exhausting. And I hadn't properly appreciated at the time how much I'd been taking on, and how much detriment that was having for me as an individual. So the kind of learning was I needed to learn a different way, and that's what I've probably been spending the last 7 or 8 years doing. I'm not going to say I'm there yet. I think I know I've still got lots to learn, and I'm definitely learning a lot about it through a master's degree I'm doing at the moment. So for this morning, my plan is to take you through 20 minutes at the most, and I'm going to share what I've been learning from a psychoanalytical perspective around how we communicate emotions with each other and what that might therefore apply to us from an HR perspective. And also share some stories and things that have kind of hopefully will demonstrate some of the concepts and the theory that I'm talking about. As Richard mentioned, we're going to give you about 15 to 20 minutes to give you an opportunity to explore some of the things that we're talking about this morning and discuss in some small groups, and then come back together for 20 minutes to discuss as a broader group. So an opportunity to ask any questions, to share some of the conversations that you came up, and then I will wrap up with a few tips in terms of things that I've learned along the way. So where are we going to start? I'm going to go back to when we all first learned to communicate. And the thing that we've all got in common as human beings is that it happened when we were born. And there's a big significant thing that happens when we're born, which is we learn that we are a creature that is fighting for survival. So up until the point where we're born, we're reliant on our mother's bodies to do everything that we need for us, and therefore we don't instinctively know that we have to fight for survival. When we're born, we suddenly have this realization that we're actually quite helpless. And to be fed, to be cleaned, to be entertained, to be held, to be comforted is all reliant on someone else and our caregiver. And so how do we therefore, without the use of or the development of speech at this point, how do we communicate our needs and how do we satisfy our needs in order to survive? And those of you that are parents probably know a lot about this. So we learn that we need to express what we need through non-verbal communication. And the classic one is obviously crying, and hence the picture on the slideshow of a crying baby. The hope is that when we cry or we express what is going on for us, that our caregiver can receive that communication, interpret it, do something with it, that it alleviates the anxiety with a little a that we're experiencing. And this is something we learn very, very early on, and is ultimately a form of communication that we don't let go of just because we learn to verbalize. We continue to have it as a form of trying to manage our internal anxieties. And so it's that which we use all the way through our lives to express things that are going on for us that we need help with to resolve. From a child perspective, obviously, we're hopeful and we are looking for our caregivers to satisfy that. And I remember personally, just a very quick story. My son is now 17, so I can just about remember this, but I remember when he was very, very young, I think he was probably around 10 days old, and he just wouldn't stop crying. And it was that cry that was really painful to listen to on an ongoing basis. And I remember sitting there feeling really helpless because I just couldn't interpret what he needed. And I was trying everything, but nothing seemed to be working. And as he grew older, I learnt to interpret the different cries. So what was the hungry cry? What was the I need changing cry? What was the I am tired cry? And therefore my ability to satisfy his needs and his anxieties improved as we grew together. And that therefore really translates into the place of work, because if we can all still utilize this form of communication, then we will know that we are going to be the recipient of kind of other people's feelings and emotions, and they're looking for us to take care of them and give them back to them in a way that is manageable. And yet it might also not be our responsibility to hold those emotions and also translate them into something that's more manageable for the other person and return them to them. So just to kind of delve into a little bit more detail around this form of communication, I want to share with you two aspects which form this part of communication. So the first is projection. And you'll see on the picture, obviously, there is clearly something, eyes in this case, being projected onto a building. It looks like a very lovely church. I wish I knew where it was. And that art of being able to kind of shine a light onto something else is a way in which we communicate. We ultimately express our emotions by shining them onto someone else. And we do that with both positive and negative emotions. So you may have times when you've walked into a meeting room, for example, and you instantly can feel a vibe in the meeting room. Yet you've heard no one speak, and you don't know what has happened before you've walked in. That ultimately is a form of projection. that the people in that meeting room are projecting some level of feelings into the space that you can now palpably feel. And we then therefore respond to those feelings that have been projected into the space. Often we tend to project more when we're feeling anxious and or we're feeling uncomfortable. But we don't, that's not completely true, because we will also project when we're happy, and you'll also have experienced when you've walked into a party and the energy that you can feel. Again, another form of projection. And projection is a really important part of communication. It helps us understand what's going on at home, out when you're with friends, and in the organisation. So being able to experience it is important, but it doesn't mean to say we need to carry it around and feel like it's totally our responsibility. The second part of communication then is splitting. And we really do use splitting to relieve our anxiety. And this is when we get into that space where generally we split the bad from within ourselves and we place it on other things and people. And we retain the good. And we do that because the bit that's most uncomfortable to sit with are generally those more negative or bad emotions. So when we were a baby, if we weren't being fed according to what we thought we needed to survive, then we would project bad emotions, for example, onto our caregivers. And that's part of that kind of releasing the anxiety. How it shows up, therefore, or kind of in today from an adult perspective in the workplace is, I'm sure many of you have heard teams in your organisation ultimately label a function the bad function, or the, oh, well, it's always finances bad responsibility, or it's always finance that say no, or it's always procurement that caused the slowdown in the process. And that's us splitting our emotions, because it's easier to sit with us sitting in the kind of positive space, and it makes it easier to kind of label something outside of ourselves from a negative point of view. But what it also does, and I think this is a kind of a really important part, is it means that we relieve ourselves of having to deal with what we might be struggling to sit with around some of those more negative emotions, because we're placing it outside of our space and putting it somewhere else, and therefore it's not shining a light on what we actually might need to be doing as our own work. Generally speaking, if we can see it in another team, it's in our team too. Splitting can be seen in all sorts of different spaces, and even if you just look at children's books, you will see all sorts of different examples of how splitting shows up as a way of kind of splitting the good from the bad. So some of these are a little bit more subtle, but many of you will know the Three Little Pigs story with the big bad wolf. A really great example of how the negative has been put into a very specific character in order to ultimately relieve the anxieties of the Three Little Pigs. And there are other stories and books that you can see on here. You might find, if you watch any programs in the next 24 or 48 hours, that just because of the art of talking about it, you'll start to see how splitting shows up in TV programs, movies, all sorts of different ways in which we represent society. So it is something that's very prolific, and you can spot it relatively quickly if you're looking for it. So to bring it all together then, in terms of how does this all work, a very simple process diagram. And if Melanie Klein was here listening with us, I probably should apologise to her, because I have massively simplified it for the basis of this presentation. It's way more complex than just is what on here. But for the case of our conversation today, I wanted to try and keep it as simple as we can. So you'll notice the green arrow at the top, where pain or anxiety is experienced by an individual. We communicate that concern. As adults, we obviously communicate it both verbally and non-verbally. And the piece that's really kind of my focus is around the expression of the emotion and the feeling, which happens through projection and splitting. That's then received by a listener. And so the blue arrows are representing the second person in this process. The listener often will be processing what the other person has been expressing, making sense of what is said, and often will then feed back to the other person the concerns in a way that can be understood. And just conscious there's a bit of feedback, so if anyone, brilliant, thank you. So from an HR perspective, why is this relevant? Partly because lots of people will see us as a bit of a caring profession. And so we will probably receive more than our fair share of people expressing pain or anxiety about what it's like to work in an organisation. And the expectation that by communicating it to you, that you're receiving it, you're processing it, and you're going to feed it back to them in a way that's reducing of the anxiety and pain, and in a way that can be understood. It happens, a lot of the psychoanalytic work is based on experiences in the medical profession and caring in the medical caring profession. So there's a real kind of parallel there. But for me, I used to very much appreciate what was spoken, but I guess I had a little bit of a blocker in appreciating how much was therefore in the non-verbal around the emotion that I was taking on as an individual, and holding myself accountable to ultimately to process and try and return in a way that the other person would feel better about themselves. Often what that might have meant is I was left holding the pain or the anxiety. And when that starts to kind of build up over time, it can be take its toll on us as individuals. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of kind of my exploration and my learning, particularly from a psychoanalytical point of view, around what can happen and how we can end up carrying a significant amount of the organisational baggage around emotions in an organisation. So what we want to do now is give you the opportunity to explore how you might have experienced this. So really simple questions in terms of consider a recent situation where you may have been left carrying another person's emotional baggage. It might not just be a person, so it could be a group, more than two, a team, and ask yourselves and share with your group what happened. What are you learning about the situation? And Richard quite rightly pointed out to me that that's a kind of live question about what are you learning, partly because my experience is you're always learning. And when you're talking about situations that have already happened, there's still loads for you to consider and learn. It doesn't just happen in the moment. And just as a snippet on that, I personally have been writing for some essays on topics like this about situations that happened to me 6-7 years ago, and there is so much to learn about them. So very deliberate choice of question. What are you learning about the situation? And then lastly, what might you do differently next time? So with that, I'm going to look to Richard to open the breakout rooms.